Somewhere in the far northwest of Russia, buried under a rusted metal cap, bolted shut with 12 heavy screws, is a hole in the ground. It doesn't look like much. A decommissioned industrial building, crumbling concrete, the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. But in the late 1980s, people who worked there started talking, not in official reports, not in scientific journals, in whispers. They said the equipment had picked up something unexpected, something coming from below, from a depth no human had ever reached before. The story spread far beyond Russia. By the early 1990s, a Norwegian radio broadcast claimed that geologists had drilled so deep into the earth that their instruments had recorded sounds, human sounds, screaming. The voices, the story went, of the damned. It became known as the well to hell. Millions of people heard about it. Religious newspapers reprinted it. Television programs picked it up. For a certain generation, it became one of those stories you never quite forgot, the one about the scientists who drilled too deep and woke something up. There's just one problem. Or maybe it isn't a problem at all. Maybe the truth is that the real story, the actual documented scientific story of what happened at this site, is even stranger than the legend, because the things they genuinely discovered down there defied everything experts thought they knew about the planet beneath our feet. And the reason the project ended? That part no one talks about. This is the story of the Kola Superdeep Borehole, and before we're done, you'll understand exactly why this hole in the ground, this ordinary-looking, sealed-off, almost forgotten relic of a vanished empire, still unsettles people who think too long about what it represents. Long before anyone drilled a single meter into the Kola Peninsula, the idea had been circulating in scientific circles for decades. The question was simple: what is actually inside the Earth? We had mapped the surface of the planet. We had sent instruments into orbit. We had developed theories about the interior based on seismic data. The way earthquake waves moved through the rock told us something about what was down there, but no one had ever confirmed it directly. No one had ever gone deep enough to actually see it. Think about what we knew. We knew there was a crust, the thin outer shell on which everything we have ever built sits. Beneath that, a mantle of hot, dense rock. Beneath that, a core. We knew this the way you might know the layout of a house you've never entered, from the outside, from inference, from educated guessing. What geologists really wanted was a core sample, a physical piece of rock pulled from a depth that no one had ever reached. Not from the surface, not from a mine shaft, but from far enough down that the rock itself would tell a story nothing on the surface could tell. A story about deep time, about the early Earth, about forces that operate on scales we can barely comprehend. The dream was to reach the Mohorovicic discontinuity, the boundary between the crust and the mantle. Scientists called it the Moho. It was thought to lie perhaps 7 to 10 kilometers below the ocean floor in certain regions, or somewhat deeper beneath the continents. If you could reach it, if you could drill through it and pull up samples from the other side, you would be holding something genuinely unprecedented. Material from a zone that had never been touched by human hands. That had never been touched by anything except pressure and heat and time. In the United States, a program called Project Mahole launched in the early 1960s with exactly this goal. It attempted to drill through the ocean floor, where the crust was thinner. It made progress. It proved that deep ocean drilling was technically possible. And then, in 1966, the US Congress cut its funding, and the project died. The Soviets were watching. The Cold War was fought in space, in ideology, in weapons arsenals, and in the quiet corners of science that most people never noticed. The space race was the visible one, rockets and astronauts and flags planted on the moon. But there was another race happening simultaneously, one that went in the opposite direction. not up, but down. When the Americans abandoned Project Mahole, Soviet scientists saw an opening. They proposed something even more ambitious: the deepest borehole ever attempted on continental crust, not in the ocean but on land, on the Kola Peninsula in the far northwest of what was then the Soviet Union, above the Arctic Circle, in some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. The Kola Peninsula was a deliberate choice. The rock there, the Baltic Shield, is among the most ancient on the planet, some of it more than 2 billion years old. To scientists, old rock was appealing precisely because it was old. Whatever had been locked inside it since the early history of the Earth was still there, preserved by pressure and depth. Drilling there wasn't just about going deep. It was about going back in time. The Soviet Academy of Sciences approved the project. Funding was allocated. A drilling site was established near the town of Zapolyarny, inside the Arctic Circle. The project was given the name Kola Superdeep Borehole, or in Russian, Kolskaya Sverhglobokaya Skvazhina. Drilling began on May 24, 1970. No one involved expected it to take 24 years. There is a reason no one had ever drilled this deep before. The engineering challenges are not simply technical. They are a confrontation with the fundamental nature of how the Earth works. Standard drilling rigs rotate a column of drill pipe with a bit at the end. As the bit grinds into rock, more pipe is added above it, extending the column. This works well for oil and gas wells, which typically reach depths of a few kilometers. At greater depths, the problems multiply quickly. The Soviet engineers used a different approach for the Kola project. Rather than rotating the entire pipe column from the surface, which becomes mechanically impossible at extreme depths, they developed a turbo drill system, where the drill bit itself was powered by the pressurized drilling fluid being pumped down the pipe. The bit rotated at the bottom. The pipe above it remained largely stationary. It was an elegant solution to a brutal problem. But elegance only goes so far. At extreme depths, drill bits don't last long. The heat and pressure destroy them. At Kola, the drilling pipe was pulled back to the surface regularly so the bit could be replaced. And each time the pipe was pulled, it had to be extracted in sections, laid out, then reassembled and sent back down. At a depth of 12 kilometers, this process alone took many days. One retrieval, one replacement, one redeployment. Days. And they had to do this hundreds of times over the course of the project. Then there was the rock itself. The Kola Peninsula's ancient crystalline rock did not behave the way models predicted. Instead of becoming more compact and rigid at depth, it became increasingly fractured and plastic. The borehole walls had a tendency to slowly close in, the rock squeezing inward under its own weight, crushing the pipe, trapping equipment. Drill bits were lost. Sections of pipe were abandoned. At one point, a section of the borehole had to be abandoned entirely, and a new branch was started from a shallower depth. By 1979, the drill had reached a depth of 9,583 meters, setting a world record for the deepest borehole ever drilled. This surpassed the previous record held by a well in Oklahoma. They kept going. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, not because of anything supernatural, but because of what the data shows. Before drilling began, geologists had models. Based on seismic measurements, they believed they understood the structure of the crust beneath the Kola Peninsula. At a certain depth, they expected to find a transition from granite-type rock to a denser, heavier type called basalt. This layer, identifiable in seismic data, was called the Conrad discontinuity. It appeared in seismic readings across the world. It seemed solid and reliable. The drill core samples told a completely different story. There was no basalt. At the depth where basalt was expected, the rock was still granite, or more precisely, metamorphic rock with a granitic composition. What had shown up in the seismic readings as a distinct boundary between different rock types turned out to be something else entirely, a zone where the same granite-type rock had been fractured and metamorphosed under heat and pressure, changing its seismic properties without changing its fundamental composition. This was a significant finding. It meant that one of the standard tools geologists use to interpret the deep structure of continental crust, seismic reflection data, was being misread. The boundaries they thought they saw weren't always what they thought they were. There were other surprises. Free water was found at depths where it was not expected to exist. At that pressure and temperature, water should have been chemically bound into minerals. Instead, it appeared to be migrating upward through microscopic fractures in the rock, squeezed out by pressure from deep below and working its way toward the surface over geological timescales. This had implications for how geologists understood fluid movement through the deep crust. Then there were the microfossils. In rock samples retrieved from depths of roughly 6 kilometers, scientists found microscopic fossilized organisms, 24 distinct species of single-celled marine plankton. Rock at that depth had been buried for hundreds of millions of years. Finding biological remnants there, still preserved, was unexpected. It told geologists something about how deeply ancient seafloor sediments had been buried during the formation of continental crust. It was not a mystery exactly. It fit into existing theories of tectonic and geological processes. But it was genuinely remarkable to hold in your hand. All of the above, the absent basalt layer, the unexpected free water, the deep microfossils, are documented findings from the Kola project. They were published in scientific literature. They reshaped specific areas of geology and geophysics, and none of them were widely reported in the press, because none of them were easy to explain in headlines. The truth the Earth offered was more complex than anyone had anticipated. Not terrifying, not supernatural, just more complicated, more layered, and more humbling than the models had suggested. Temperature was the enemy no one had fully prepared for. Based on existing models, scientists expected the temperature to increase with depth at a relatively predictable rate, roughly 15 degrees Celsius per kilometer in ancient crystalline rock of the type found at Kola. This was the established geothermal gradient for that kind of geology. It was the basis for all the project's engineering plans. The actual gradient turned out to be nearly double that. As the drill descended past 10 kilometers, temperatures at the drill tip were reaching 180 degrees Celsius and climbing. At the depths the project eventually reached, conditions at the bottom of the borehole exceeded 300 degrees Celsius. This changes everything. Rock that behaves as a solid at cooler temperatures begins to behave more plastically at extreme heat. It flows slowly over time. It deforms. The borehole walls became increasingly unstable. The drill pipe, thousands of meters of it hanging in a column from the surface, expanded with heat, changed its behavior, became harder to control. The drilling fluid, which had to be pumped down and back up continuously to cool the equipment and carry rock chips to the surface, had to be engineered and re-engineered to function under these conditions. Ordinary drilling mud would have failed. The fluids used at Kola were specialized, carefully formulated, and still pushed to their limits. Progress slowed dramatically in the late 1980s. Each meter required more time, more equipment, more maintenance. The borehole had by now branched. A secondary bore had been drilled around a section where equipment had been lost, and the integrity of the hole itself required constant monitoring. In 1989, at a depth of 12,262 meters, roughly 12 kilometers below the surface, the drill encountered conditions that made continued progress essentially impossible with the available technology. The rock at that depth, superheated and under extraordinary pressure, behaved less like solid material and more like a slow, grinding plastic. Equipment failures became constant. A major accident occurred in which a section of the drilling assembly was lost deep in the hole. Drilling continued intermittently until 1992. The final recorded depth of the Kola Superdeep Borehole was 12,262 meters, or approximately 12.26 kilometers. It remains, to this day, the deepest artificial point ever created on Earth. In 1992, the project was suspended. In 1995, it was formally shut down. Funding had evaporated along with the Soviet Union itself, which had collapsed in 1991. The new Russian state had neither the resources nor the political will to continue. The borehole was capped. The research institute that had run the project for more than 2 decades was gradually wound down. Scientists dispersed. Equipment rusted. The building above the borehole, a peculiar circular structure built to house the specialized derrick used in the turbo drill system, began to decay. When journalists and explorers began visiting the site years later, they found it in an advanced state of abandonment. Broken windows, collapsed ceilings, equipment left exactly where it had been when the project ended. The borehole itself, that narrow puncture in the crust of the planet, roughly 23 centimeters in diameter, barely wide enough to fit a large grapefruit, was sealed beneath a welded metal cap. It sat there, silent, 12 kilometers deep, into rock that was more than 2 billion years old. And then the story arrived. In 1989, a Finnish newspaper called Amenusastia published a story claiming that Soviet scientists drilling in Siberia had broken through into a cavern and lowered a heat-resistant microphone into the hole. What the microphone reportedly captured was terrifying. The screaming of millions of people, tormented, in agony. The temperature at the bottom of the hole, the story claimed, had been measured at 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to be consistent with descriptions of hell. One scientist, according to the account, had reportedly fled the site after witnessing a winged demonic figure emerge from the hole and carve a message in the sky. The story was picked up by a Norwegian Christian radio broadcast. From there, it spread. By the early 1990s, it had been reprinted in religious publications across the United States and Europe. People were sharing cassette tapes of the supposed audio recording. The recording that circulated, the audio clip people heard on those cassette tapes and later on early internet forums, was real audio. It was not fabricated from silence. The sounds on it were genuinely disturbing, a roaring, layered noise with what sounded to some listeners like screaming voices buried inside it. It was not from the Kola borehole. Audio investigators and journalists who looked into the story traced the clip to a 1972 film score, specifically a horror soundtrack. The screaming voices were not recorded in the earth. They were recorded in a studio. The Finnish newspaper article that started the story has never been definitively traced to a specific author or verified source. It appears to have originated as what might now be called a piece of Christian propaganda, designed to support a theological argument about the literal existence of hell, and to have been presented as fact. The actual Kola borehole was not in Siberia. It was on the Kola Peninsula. The temperature at the bottom was approximately 300 degrees Celsius, not 1,000. No microphone was lowered into the hole. The borehole was filled with drilling fluid and was far too narrow and pressurized for that kind of experiment. No scientists reported supernatural phenomena. No official records, no personal accounts, no documents of any kind support the supernatural elements of the story. None of this stopped it from spreading, because the story wasn't really about the borehole. It was about something else. A fear that exists at the edge of all deep exploration, scientific or otherwise. The fear of what you might find if you go far enough into the unknown. The fear that there are places humans are not meant to reach. That some doors, if opened, cannot be closed. The Kola borehole became a vessel for that fear. An empty vessel in the supernatural sense, but a real one, filled with genuine strangeness, genuine discovery, and genuine limits. Perhaps that's why the myth found such a perfect home there. The borehole is still there. If you drive to the right part of the Kola Peninsula, find the right abandoned building and look at the ground beneath the rusted cap, you are standing above the deepest point any human being has ever physically reached into this planet. It took 24 years. The finest geological engineers of a superpower, millions of rubles, thousands of personnel, technologies invented specifically for this project. And after all of that, after all the broken drill bits, the lost equipment, the unexpected temperatures, the plastically deforming rock, they had gone 12.26 kilometers. They hadn't reached the mantle. They hadn't reached the Conrad discontinuity. They hadn't even gotten particularly close. They had gone, as a proportion of the distance to the Earth's center, about as far as a person who takes one step toward the horizon has traveled towards quiet. And yet what they found in those 12 kilometers rewrote chapters of geology. The rock didn't behave the way the models said it would. The seismic data was being misread. Water was moving through the deep crust in ways that weren't predicted. Ancient life had been buried deeper than anyone thought. The Earth was more complicated, more dynamic, more resistant to simple understanding than the science of the mid-20th century had assumed. The well-to-hell story spread because it offered something the real discoveries didn't. An answer. A clear, dramatic, narrative answer. The Earth contained hell. The scientists found it. The gates were sealed. There was meaning at the bottom. The real story offers something harder and stranger than that. It offers the discovery that the Earth resists us, that our instruments and models and carefully constructed expectations run up against reality and shatter. That 12 kilometers down, in rock older than complex life on this planet, the ground pushes back. It closes the hole. It swallows the equipment. It raises its temperature until the technology fails. It refuses. Maybe that's more terrifying than anything a screaming audio clip could suggest. Not that something is down there waiting for us, but that after everything, after decades and billions and the full force of human ingenuity, we barely scratched the surface, and the Earth didn't even notice.